Welcome to the People's Basics. I'm John Munitz, and today in our episode at the Basic Breakdown at the People's Basics, we are going to be doing an episode on the history of basic income. We want to provide you all with a very brief, detailed account of where basic income originated from all the way to the present. So we are going to be covering from the 16th century all the way to the 21st century, because this idea of basic income is really not that new. It is an idea that has been advocated for hundreds of years. And so we really wanted to give an accounting of this to really show you all how much progress has been made on the front of advocacy for a guaranteed income. On the program today, we're going to be doing things a little bit differently. Jackie was not able to join me for this week's recording. However, she will be joining us for the segment at the end when we have an interview with Diane Pagen about some aspects of universal basic income, particularly why it's so much more efficient than the existing means-tested welfare of the day. So stay tuned to the end to be able to see that interview. But let's start to go into that history a little bit, and I want to start from the very beginning. So citations of where this idea even starts to kind of come from is really rooted in the 16th century and Thomas More in his book, Utopia. He is quoted as saying as such, "The method of dealing with thieves is both unjust and undesirable. As a punishment, it's too severe, and as a deterrent, it's quite ineffective. Petty larceny isn't bad enough to deserve the death penalty, and no penalty on earth will stop people from stealing. If it's their only way of getting food, in this respect, you English, like most other nations, remind me of these incompetent schoolmasters who prefer caning their pupils to teaching them. Instead of inflicting these horrible punishments, it would be far more to the point to provide everyone with some means of livelihood so that nobody's under the frightful necessity of becoming first a thief and then a corpse." This is basically the establishment that, each individual has this inherent need to be benefited from society, to have this basic standard provided to them so that they don't feel the need to have to steal it in order to obtain the basics. This theory kind of starts to progress, and we then have our next person, Johannes Ludavis. In a memoir he addressed that the mayor of Bruges in 1526 under the title De Subvient Pauperem, or On the Assistance to the Poor, he proposed that the municipal government should be given the responsibility of securing a subsistence minimum to all its residents, not on the grounds of justice, but for the sake of a more effective exercise of morally required charity. The assistance scheme would be closely targeted to the poor. Indeed, it is because of their ability to target them more efficiently that public officials should put in charge of poor relief. To be entitled to be a poor person's poverty must not be undeserved, but he must deserve the help he gets by proving his willingness to work. So this is, again, taking the notion that it is the responsibility of government to try and help its people, not necessarily on the idea of it being a right yet, but on the idea of it being a more efficient system than simply having to rely on charity. This continues, and now we skip a little bit forward into the 18th century, where we start to have someone named Thomas Paine start to really create the idea of actually a basic income. Not just basic necessities, but the idea of providing actual currency to people. And so his idea was, at the turning of 21, an individual would be provided 15 pounds of sterling. Not too much, but, a basic investment to kind of start your life, kind of have some seed funding to really be able to either get into the trades or maybe be able to acquire a home eventually. This was kind of that prospect of kickstarting people's careers. And then furthermore, he adds on a proposal that at the age of 50, that people be provided 10 pounds of sterling per year. And so this kind of is a reflection of what is eventually going to become our social security system. And likewise this year, we have another individual, Antoine Cartier, who basically his writings are inspiring Otto von Bismarck's old age pension and health insurance plans and on the notion of just the value of universalism. This came in his writings of Equies d'un tableau historique de progrès de l'esprit humain, which was written in 1795. This goes on now into the 19th century with a philosopher by the names of Charles Fourier. He is quoted as a utopian socialist philosopher, and he is the first person to inherently make the case for a basic endowment as a human right. And this comes in his literature, La Face Industrie. Fourier argues that the violation of each person's fundamental natural right to hunt, fish, pick fruit, and let her/his cattle graze on the commons implies that civilization owes subsistence to everyone unable to meet her/his needs in a form of a 6th-class hotel room and 3 modest meals per day. So again, this isn't exactly universal basic income, but we're now starting to get into the philosophy of when these things of providing a basic via the government is starting to become a little bit more mainstreamed, and that it should be an actual right by humans because government is currently denying them other ways of providing subsistence to themselves because of private property ownership, not allowing people to have these rights to hunt, fish, pick fruit, etc. that they described before. This continues into 1845. Victor Considerant, he's a disciple of Fourier. He comes up with the idea of a recurring income for all adults without a work test. But it still means tested. And this comes in his works, Exposition abrégée du système philistère de Fourier. So again, this is kind of like building off his mentor's work. This continues now to 1848, where we have Joseph Charlier come up with the idea of a territorial dividend. He said, saw the equal right to ownership of land as the foundation of an unconditional right to some income. But he rejected both the right to means-tested assistance advocated by Charles Fourier himself and the right to paid work advocated by his most prominent disciple, Victor Considerant. The former, he reckoned, only dealt with the effects, and the latter involved too much mingling by the state. Under the labels minimum or revenu grantee, and later the dividend territorial, he proposed giving every citizen with an unconditional right to quarterly payment of an amount fixed annually by a representative. This would be the National Council on the basis of the rental value of all real estate. So it's a UBI kind of based off what are the going rates of rent. He says that this would end the domination of capital over labor. And he questioned on the work disincentive. He goes on to say, hard luck for the lazy. They will be put on short allowance. Society's duty does not reach beyond securing each a fair share of enjoyment of what nature puts at his disposal without usurping anyone's rights. Then we go to 1849, where we have John Stuart Mill. Joseph Charlier's works actually didn't get much traction. We certainly are aware of it, but at the time, not a lot of people were actually reading it. But John Stuart Mill was a big, major influence. And, he elaborates that the idea in a more popular manner than even Joseph Charlier. He's quoted, the most skillfully combined and with the greatest foresight of objections of all the forms of socialism is commonly known as Fourierism. This system does not contemplate the abolition of private property, nor even of inheritance. On the contrary, it avowedly takes into consideration as elements in the distribution of the produce, capital, as well as labor. In the distribution, a certain minimum is first assigned for the subsistence of every member of the community, whether capable of labor. The remainder of the produce is shared in certain proportions to be determined beforehand among the three elements: labor, capital, and talent. Now we're starting to work here with the idea of having a blend of a universal basic income into an existing kind of capitalist type of system, where it's not getting rid of private ownership rights, but it is saying before we compete with each other and let our talents express how much prosperity we get, let us work together to establish a common basic standard for subsistence. This carries on. Now we're approaching the 20th century with Bertrand Russell in 1918. In his works in Roads to Freedom, he makes the case for UBI in an anarcho-socialist system. He is quoted as such: "Anarchism has the advantage as regards liberty, socialism as regards the inducement to work. Can we not find a method of combining these two advantages? It seems to me that we can. Stated in more familiar terms, that the plan we are advocating amounts essentially to this: that a certain small income, sufficient for necessaries, should be secured to all, whether they work or not, and that a larger income, as much larger as might be warranted by the total amount of commodities produced, should be given to those who are willing to engage in some work which the community recognizes as useful. When education is finished, no one should be compelled to work, and those who choose not to work should receive a bare livelihood and be left completely free." It's a beautiful sentiment that we should not be so bound by workism in the pursuit of survival, but that we should not be affording people luxury or increasing levels of comfort if they're not willing to work to contribute to society. Now, obviously, some people will need to support, but this general notion of providing the basics and then letting people go above that is what's starting to be established in this work. At this time, we actually start seeing some people start to actually try these things out. We have it in Dennis Milner and Major Douglas, where they try to do these different cash relief and universal credit programs between 1918 and 1924. Then we skip a little bit ahead. We've now gone through the wars of World War I and World War II, which frankly took a lot of the priority in people's minds. And we reach William Beveridge in 1943. He is an economist. He is the Board of Trade as Director and Secretary Minister of Food under Churchill. And he is a big force for trying to derail the movement by making social insurance and child assistance the norm instead of basic income proposals. We then kind of have to wait for a bit for a new person to really emerge to really start to push these things forward again, where we get George D.H. Cole, who is credited with coining the phrase basic income. He did this in his book, J.S. Mill in History of Socialist Thought. Then we go a little bit further, and we now are, again, away from the socialists, and we're now leaning towards some of the more conservative elements of it, where we have a Milton Friedman start to embrace this idea of giving people cash as a way of providing for the basics when he introduces the idea of the negative income tax. Not the same as basic income, as it's, again, it's a means-tested program that makes the determination of how much you receive, but we're starting to advance the needle towards this becoming a more broadly consensus policy instead of just a socialist-leaning policy. Then in 1964, advocacy in America really starts to begin by Robert Theobald. He forms an ad hoc committee on triple revolution. Quote, "Automation is rendering work for pay obsolete, and that government handouts are the only way to give the public the means to buy the immense bounty produced by automation." So yeah, Yang folks out there, the central message of Yang's campaign isn't actually all that new. It's just new for like the real big mainstream and people running for president on the idea. This is an idea of since, as I just said, 1964. The idea that automation was going to be a threat to labor and that people would need to be provided an income in that process to be able to survive, or at least have the basics of society. Then in 1967, James Tobin published the first technical analysis of negative income tax schemes, where they came out in favor of a variant involving an automatic payment to all citizens. In contrast with Friedman's proposal, Tobin's Demogrant scheme was not meant to replace the whole system of social assistance and insurance schemes, let alone to help extinguish the welfare state altogether, like Milton Friedman wanted. Frankly, Milton Friedman wasn't as big of a fan of the idea of just providing it for subsistence. He really wanted it to be a method of weeding people off the means-tested welfare state. He actually wasn't exactly even like a huge advocate of negative income tax on its own merits, but simply that it is a better replacement to what is, and that he would hope over time, after he eliminated that welfare state, he could eventually wean people off that negative income tax as well. So be wary of some people who want to push the schemes as well. They sometimes are using it as a ploy. Now, mind you, it doesn't always have to be a problem to want to replace certain programs to fund a larger universal one. But it matters of what is the intention and what is the size of that program and what measures do you put in place to protect it long term. So we continue that he basically goes, under Tobin's proposal, more generous than Freeman's and more precise than Theobald's, each household was to be granted a basic credit at a level vying with family composition, which each family could supplement with earnings and other income taxed at uniform rate. Then we have in 1968, we really are starting to organize behind this idea. And we have a petition in the spring of 1968. And the petition was to adopt this year a system of income guarantees and supplement. And this was supported by James Tobin, Paul Samuelson, John Kenneth Galbraith, Robert Lampman, Harold Watts, and over 1,000 economists, though notably not Milton Friedman. So, again, it's because Milton Friedman didn't actually support the idea. He was truly trying to do a libertarian Trojan horse. So, yeah, it's great. We're starting to build up support, and now this idea is starting to become embraced by, frankly, presidential candidates. We have Democrat Daniel Moynihan and even Republican President Richard Nixon coming together to do a plan. And, this is really being done in the Senate, so they haven't run yet on this idea. The Family Assistance Plan is what it's called. Eventually, this is something that Richard Nixon eventually starts to run on when he does run for president. But this was a bipartisan effort by Moynihan and Nixon to try and create the Family Assistance Plan, which provided for the abolition of the aid program targeting poor families and incorporated a guaranteed income with financial supplements for workers, which came close to a negative income tax scheme. This was supported in the House in 1970, but then eventually killed in the Senate in 1972 by a coalition of progressives and conservatives, thinking that the bill was simultaneously too bold from the conservative side and also too timid from the progressive side. A little familiar to now, if you ask me a bit. But now we start to have the Democratic Party really start to at least seemingly embrace the idea full-throatedly. George McGovern, who becomes eventually the Democratic nominee in 1972, eventually losing, though, for reasons we're about to get into, he embraces a bolder version of the Family Assistance Plan and calls it a Demogrant for his presidential campaign. But then when he wins the nomination, he basically abandons the proposal altogether. Unfortunately, that is a lot of how, unfortunately, Democrats run elections a lot of the times. They're bold and they're promising good things in a primary, and then when it comes time to the general, they triangulate and moderate to that position of abandoning these things. Mind you, I'm not going to say it's all Democrats, but it's too many. And so eventually, frankly, due to the distractions of Watergate, a lot of the conversation around this idea really starts to fade in America. However, it's not dead altogether. We still have some stuff in the 1970s happening now in Europe. So, we have J.P. Cooper in 1976. He is quoted as saying, "Struck by how sick some people were, able to make themselves by working too much, while others were making themselves sick because they could not find work, he recommended uncoupling employment and income as a way of countering the dehumanizing nature of paid employment. Only a decent guaranteed income, as he called it, would enable people to develop independently and autonomously." A big thought about this idea of inherently that universal basic income and workism are inherently at odds with a lot of it. Universal basic income says that basic subsistence should be guaranteed, and that fundamentally we should not be working to survive, but we should be working to be able to help society because it interests us and because it will help us achieve prosperity. It continues. In 1977, it gets actually embraced by the Dutch Christian Democratic Party, the first parliamentary party with representation to feature UBI on their platform. The movement grew due to major support from the food sector trade union, the Bundesbond, which had a high proportion of women and part-time workers. Furthermore, it gets developed a little bit further in 1985 by the Scientific Council for Government Policy. The Dutch discussion basically reached its first climax when the prestigious Scientific Council for Government Policy created a sensation by publishing a report in which it recommended unambiguously the introduction of a so-called partial basic income. Such a partial basic income is a genuine UBI, but at a level insufficient to cover the needs of a single person and hence not meant to replace the existing conditional minimum income system. An interesting idea. I don't know exactly why one would want to choose to not provide for the basic subsistence. It still encourages that workism mindset, but it's now formally, we have a major embrace by institutions of this idea. But now, let's turn back to America and even some of the rest of the world beyond Europe. So let's backtrack just a couple years to America in 1982. This is when we established in Alaska the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is essentially the first implemented universal basic income. It's not exactly a basic income in the sense that it is not a fixed flat amount of income. It is dependent on how much revenue is produced. It is a dividend, after all. And it is a dividend that's basically given to every Alaskan after they've established 6 months of residency in Alaska. In 2020, the amount given was $992. This is on an annual basis. However, the highest amount given was in 2015, where all of their citizens received $2,072 in that year. In the mid-1970s, like in the formation of this idea, Jay Hammond, who was a Republican governor of the state of Alaska, was concerned that the huge wealth generated by oil money in Prudhoe Bay, was, the largest oil field in North America overall, would only benefit the current population of the state. In 1976, the Alaska Permanent Fund was created by an amendment to the state constitution. In order to get the Alaskan population interested in its growth and continuity, Governor Hammond conceived of the annual payment of a dividend to all residents in proportion to the number of years of residence. This was unfortunate, well, not unfortunately, but it was brought forward to the Supreme Court, and it was actually found violating the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution for violating rights of migrants from other states. And so in turn, it no longer did this rewarding of how long have you actually been there. But now we have our first example of a basic income, not a monthly level, but still an annual income that everyone receives. And mind you, it is not, again, a flat amount. It is a dividend. And again, it's not exactly enough for your basic subsistence needs, but we've established it now in America, the idea of giving income to all of one's citizens, at least within this state context of Alaska. Then we move forward. Our next big example of universal basic income worldwide is in Iran, actually, in 2011. They basically decided to replace subsidies on gasoline, electricity, and some food products with a basic income of basically 29% of the median income, or roughly $480 per year as of 2011, which would be equivalent to $9,029 being given annually in America, essentially. So now we come back to America again, and we go with Andrew Yang's the next big thing, really. In 2017, his run for the presidency really took the idea and popularized it. At the beginning of that campaign, universal basic income was polling roughly around 25% with the population. Today, it's now at 65%, and at the end of his campaign, it had finally reached a majority support in 2020. And mind you, 2020, frankly, was a year that created a massive expansion of the movement, frankly, from the pandemic, making it very clear the need for income support and a guaranteed income when people can't get work because it's unsafe for us to get together and potentially work in person, or there isn't as much demand on our businesses because other people aren't going out to come demand the products and services. And so this has resulted in some basic income pilots getting, frankly, trialed in Spain to a huge degree. They decided that they were going to start with 850,000 of its poorest residents and give them a basic income. And then we have now, even in America in 2020, we've had mayors across the country start to embrace this idea of universal basic income. Mind you, it's not universal on their level, but the idea of a basic income in their communities and advocating for a universal basic income countrywide. Right now, there are 43 mayors and 43 cities that have embraced a guaranteed income for all of their citizens. They're trying it to certain degrees with pilot programs before expanding it, hopefully, to their entire cities. So, with that being said, everyone, that's our brief but detailed breakdown of the history of basic income. Please let us know what you think about that, and what do you think the future of basic income is going to be? Where do you think our next big moments are going to come? And how are you looking to organize on this issue? We really want to hear from you on your thoughts. But with that being said, everyone, I want to help us transition to our wonderful interview that we had with Diane Pagen. As well, Jackie will be here for that episode as well. So with that being said, let's get into today's interview with Diane Pagen.
Okay, we're here with our guest today, Diane Pagen. She is a social worker and the co-founder of the Basic Income March. Diane, it's such a pleasure to be able to have you on the program today. Welcome to the People's Basics.
Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate
you're very
it a lot.
welcome. So, Diane, we wanted to have you on today to be able to continue the conversation we were having on the history of basic income, but we want to focus a little bit more on the present. I'd love to ask you, you've been an advocate of basic income for a while. Where do you feel like we are in the movement's history? Do you feel like we're nearing the finish line? Do you feel like we have a while to go to achieve it? Where do you feel like we are in a historical perspective?
I feel like we're really that while whatever universal basic income we eventually are able to get, it is probably going to happen quite soon. I feel that there's going to be a development after we get whatever we get on a national level. It's going to continue to evolve. But in terms of winning something that is universal and national, I feel like we're really, we've come a very long way. And if you think about it, I mean, even though the concept goes back prior to the 1960s, I like to use the 1960s and Martin Luther King and the original Poor People's Campaign as a benchmark for the fervor around and the legitimacy around the idea in modern times. And I do feel that it's accelerated a great deal in the past, say, 5 years. And I think we're in a really good place right now.
That's encouraging to hear. So, one thing I wanted to follow up on that is, there was clearly a lull in the basic income movement after the 70s until more recently in the 2020s. There's been a big resurgence around the idea. What do you think are the main drivers for why it took so long for this conversation to reemerge?
Wow, so that is such a great question, and I think that the answer probably lay in the in leadership of the country across parties, legitimizing the idea of means testing to such a point that we actually started to legitimize compulsory work. If you think about it, compulsory work, there were times in our history we thought we had categorically done away with compulsory work, with enslaving people and forcing them to do things, sometimes very, very dangerous, exploitative things. We have a long history of exploiting Black people and Native Americans and just about, there's just so much of it in our history, right? So I think what happened is after the 70s, there was a shift toward this ideology of favoring very cheap, finding ways to favor very cheap labor and to remove agency from people's lives, particularly the lives of women. And in order to make the market favorable to exploiting people's unpaid labor and paying very low wages and exploiting women, we kind of shifted this narrative to where suddenly means testing was considered just very, very legitimate, and forced work was considered quite legitimate. And if you think about it, it's been like 30 years since dependent children was turned into temporary assistance for needy families, and temporary assistance to needy families really shifted all of its aims into forcing people to work and removing children from their primary caregivers. So I think that when that's your narrative in a country, there's no space for talking about giving people money. It was completely intentional to have one overshadow the other, I believe. Short version.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty reasonable synopsis. I think there is a lot that we've gotten to talk about in the evolution of the concept into a more universal system. I'd love for you to just lay out a little bit more about, why you think it is so important for the universal part, because one of the things that we talked about during our own segment was that in our history, the reason kind of why it got derailed in the 70s is that we could not satisfy all the different factions on how they wanted a basic income designed. And there are a lot of people, generally more on the left side of things, who derail things like a basic income, and I take this from experience from watching at least the Andrew Yang campaign, derailing it for potentially consolidating some means-tested systems as a funding source. Could you elaborate, in your opinion, why we should be moving to more universal systems?
Yes. So essentially, any good social policy, you could think of some examples. For example, universal child allowances and things like that. You could think of it. You could think about, for example, Social Security survivors benefits, for example. So those, those are two examples of social policies that are very popular and very, very effective. I mean, they weren't without error but they are very effective and very popular because they're very simple to administer. Because you meet one simple criteria, it's pretty much universal within the criteria it has, right? So if you're a survivor, if your partner dies and you were legally married, then you get survivor benefits. And nobody says to you, oh, you can't get them because you make $10 a month more than you need to, or, you can't get them because you have, 4 kids instead of 2 kids. There's nothing like that. And people like universality because universality is very unifying. And it makes things cheaper. It's just logic. Anything, if I have to, decide, if I know that, I'm going to give out a universal benefit and there's 100 people, if everyone gets it, then everyone gets it immediately and expediently, and I don't have to spend time figuring out whether you meet criteria. And so those kinds of programs are really, really popular. And for example, in Europe, there's lots of child allowances in a variety of countries. They're extremely popular. Nobody points fingers and says, oh, you don't need that because you make twice what I make. No, that's not how it goes. And I would venture to say that part of the reason that in some European nations there's more of a sense of a national identity and a collective identity is because they have these programs that they know everyone gets. So then just circling back, what I wanted to say is the reason that universality is so important is because it just has so many important knockoff effects. So it's cheaper. It prevents harm to the people who get it because you can really never get knocked off of it the way you can get knocked off of means-tested programs and programs that have a lot of paperwork involved, right? So, so that's really, really ideal. And then, another part of it, then you've got added, it makes it more effective and it makes it more popular. So in terms of just as an example of what a universal basic income, how it would be better, I have, there's a particular person of the different clients that I've had and have as a social worker. There's a particular person who I've been helping with a range of things. I do it kind of pro bono, because there are pro bono social work, just like there's pro bono law. And the person that I've been helping, this particular person, this past weekend and also in January, he got knocked off of his food stamp allotment. Now, this person has a mobility impairment. He has partial paraplegia, he can't work in the sense, he's great at a lot of things, but he can't work in that sense because of this disability that he has. And his Social Security income is about 65% of a poverty line income. What error of any kind would knock that man off of food stamps? So he spent the whole weekend without food stamps. We had to do cartwheels to get him food and this and that. And today they're straightening it out because it's a paperwork glitch. The thing is, like, why would you even make that person go through qualifying every 6 months? You know that even on the best day, his income is 65% of the poverty line. I bring that up because this is a phenomenon that affects, tens of millions of SNAP recipients, and that's one of the good programs. It's actually administered quite well compared to other ones, but it's a reality of SNAP that every 6 months, most of the people on it have to do a paperwork action or an online action, and if they don't do it or something gets messed up, that's it. They just cut you off. And it doesn't matter that they know when they press the button to cut you off that they know that you're still qualified. So a universal basic income would be a great thing because no one would ever have to requalify, send anything in, etc. And when you do that, it's not just that you're not just making the program more convenient. What you're doing, and it's like I'm really not exaggerating, you're saving people's lives. Because if it takes a week or 2 weeks to get your food back on the table, that's a tremendous problem. There are people who can become, any of us can become ill from not eating, but there are people who quite literally can die from not eating for a few days. And the idea that somehow they're going to find food or somehow they're going to have some private enterprise to help them, or they're going to be able to find a food pantry is it's patently cruel. So, that would be that's just a practical example of why a UBI is better. Or really even better than almost any means-tested program. Even if the means-tested program were the same amount of money as the UBI.
Yeah, my mom is on Social Security and she was trying to still work, but now COVID happened. So she was on unemployment and she lost it. And she spent an entire day trying to get back on. I told this story already, but I said, now imagine if you had a child, like a young child, and you were trying to homeschool right now, or if you had a part-time job or a full-time job and you were you wouldn't be able to jump through the hoops. So it's just so dehumanizing to have to prove that you're poor, and that
Right.
goes with all of those, where that inequity comes from is that you say, oh, you've seen the posts where it's like, oh, they had their EBT card and they had a Gucci handbag or whatever. I mean, it's so anecdotal. You don't know anything about those people, but
Right.
just that perception is so dehumanizing and it creates that other. So the universal bit of UBI is like, you can't shame anybody with it. It's beautiful.
Yeah, it sure is. I mean, it really is beautiful. And actually, I would say you're making me think of E.F. Schumacher, who wrote a book in the 60s called Small is Beautiful. I guess he was an economist, philosopher, something of that nature. And it's really true. Like when you think about a UBI is small, but it's not small in the way of size, but in its simplicity.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a beauty to simplicity. When you make something complex and it hurts people because it's complex, that's bad.
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes that I try to say every day is the ultimate simplicity is the ultimate sophistication, and that's Leonardo da Vinci. And it's elegant. It's just simple. Give everybody money, and just watch us flourish as a country and as a society.
Yeah, Diane, one question that I had in this is that, some people bring up the notion of the benefit of a service is that it kind of guarantees someone can secure something regardless of market fluctuations. One of the benefits of, they say for SNAP, is that it guarantees someone can acquire food. Even if food prices go up, which a basic income, they say, some of them, I disagree with them, can cause inflation. And so their motive is saying that if you just give people money, it'll increase prices and they won't be able to secure the goods that are the actual things they need to live, because you can't actually eat the money. You can't live inside the money. You have to end up using it on something. How do you treat those people who say they advocate more for just universal basic services and not the income side? What do you tell them about what the value of income is specifically?
Mm-hmm. Well, to the point of as an example of the food stamps. So you can't eat your food stamps either, right? I mean, it's a credit onto a card, and you can't eat that card. You have to spend it. And again, I'm not dogging food stamps in any way. Food stamps is a relatively well-known, historically better run program than say public assistance. But to those people, I would say, well, food stamps doesn't assure that everyone will get food, because you have to be found eligible and enrolled in it, and you can't get kicked off the way my client was. And the way many people are over and over again throughout the year. So that's no guarantee of food. Similarly, if they're talking about food distribution programs like food pantries, which are funded with federal money and state money and private money, you look at some of the very large conglomerates that do that distribute to local food banks. There's no guarantee that if you fund those very well that everyone will get anyway. I mean, if you think about it, the logistics of a food bank are horrific and overwhelming. You have to be, just as a practical matter, you have to be in relatively good health to line up for food. In many places, you have to have a car to go retrieve the food. There's a certain degree of illogic to it, as the people who run them, which are, like I'm talking about the volunteers and the people on the ground, are extremely well-meaning, caring people, but they have to make decisions about, if they've got to fill 100 boxes and they only have like 50 things of orange juice, which box gets the orange juice? Who gets the real milk and who gets the fake milk? Or you know what I mean.
Sure.
Who do you give peanut butter when you don't have jelly? Do you give pasta when you don't have sauce? Like, it's just not logical. And anybody who works in food distribution, I think, would have to agree that, as well-meaning as it is, and do they help people? Well, of course they do. But wouldn't it be better if people, of various ages and illnesses and things didn't have to line up in the hot sun to get food, or sit in their cars, running their engines and polluting the environment, to get food? Let's make it expedient, because that method of distribution is so expensive, and it really diverts millions of dollars in places that could be used for direct cash transfers, which are, as I know you guys know, we all think that they're more humane, and I think that we're right. I don't think that you can argue if there's one point about basic income and cash transfers that cannot be argued, the argument has been won, is that cash is more humane and it affords people dignity and agency. And that's, everybody wants that and everybody has the right to have it.
Yeah, one of the words I come back to over and over again is empowerment. Like, you decide what is the best decision for you. And it's our one, existence. It's our one life. Like, I think that I probably have a better idea of what I need personally than a bureaucrat or even a well-meaning volunteer.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, you have, and the other part of that is that it's not, so it's not like a zero sum kind of thing. You can't have this model of basic services, and have it be untouchable. Because as a social worker, what I can tell you is that there's kind of this idea that you sometimes hear in the social services world, particularly as it refers to income distribution, is that that we can't defund services to create as part of a means of funding a cash transfer, because if you do that, you are harming the people who consume the services. And to that, again, I mean, we have to have a conversation amongst the people ourselves and, people who might believe that, as to, well, I mean, it's not realistic to say that every service that's been created for poor people is actually helpful to them, is actually life enhancing to them. And all you have to do, I could name 5 examples right now, but how about the New York City Department of Homeless Services that has a $2.1 billion a year budget, and there's been an minimal, a teeny tiny decrease in homelessness in the last year. And I hate to say it, and I hate to be morbid, but I know where that decrease came from, and it didn't come from housing people. It came because there's also, at the same time, there's been a 40% increase in deaths of homeless people in New York City. So, there's been this tiny decrease. It's like almost not even worth mentioning, but to the degree there has been an increase, it's because in New York City, regressive non-cash solutions to homelessness are killing our homeless people. And it's not just, I don't think that a guaranteed income to any particular group is going to, let's say to people who are homeless right now, or universal basic income is going to completely solve the problem of homelessness. But I can tell you that if you give people cash, they are going to use it to survive. And right now, in the New York City homelessness services world, there is no cash for anyone, because the whole thing is just, they give extremely large contracts to shelter providers, and the shelter providers they will not give one red cent to a homeless person in their shelter without, some kind of paperwork trail. And people die as a result, because if they're too scared to go into a shelter, because we all know, that there's no such thing as, one of these like fabulous shelters that they all seem to want to pretend that they run. People who are homeless on the street, they vote with their feet and they don't go to shelters. That's why that's why people who are homeless prefer the subway. It's a lot safer than a homeless shelter, and you don't get yelled at or beat up. You don't get your possessions taken from you. And so, we have to look at some of these services and we have to say, okay, well, you're saying that we shouldn't have, we shouldn't remove services to fund a basic income. Well, actually what we should do is we should identify services that are costly and that are not benefiting people and that are harming people, and we should eliminate those, and then we can take that money and yes, it can be used for UBI. And if we find, a great service program that the users really like and they really want it, then of course we'll keep that. But why would we keep everything?
I think that's just such common sense. And your story about how it impacts homelessness really resonated with me, because when I kind of started to bump up universal basic income up my priority list, I already liked it, but I realized how important it was frankly going into New York City from when I was working and actually meeting homeless people, having a meal with them, volunteering, and actually talking to them about, like, what are their needs? What is working? What isn't working? And your point about how many people are simply scared of the shelters, because a lot of them, there can be mental illnesses which can be causing people to be homeless. There could be drug use. There can be former people from the prison system that are coming out and need home shelters that come from a lot of the gangs. There's a lot of fear about going to those. And I remember I got to talk to this one guy named Frank, and I was going through a bunch of different policy platforms that I really liked. And I recall him breaking down in absolute tears when I told him about the concept of universal basic income, even when I named things like a job guarantee or guaranteed housing. That was the thing that resonated with him the most because of two factors. It gave him agency, and it showed that people actually trust him. Like, right. That's another thing. These people in these dire situations, they feel worthless too. Like, there is a demoralizing feeling about being homeless, and having something where it's not a paternalistic judgment of, we think we know what's best for you, but here is direct empowerment. You go choose how you want to go make your life better. That shows trust in a person's ability to make smart decisions. And so, Diane, my final question for you is, could you talk a little bit more about how universal basic income might interact with housing? Because again, I know some left critics say, oh, they're just going to raise the rents if we give people a basic income, compared to if you give housing vouchers, it's like, oh, you're guaranteed. Could you talk a little bit more about why you think UBI would do a big help for homelessness? I know it's an issue you really care about.
Yeah. So, again, it's really interesting to find that we kind of put forth these policies that are in existence that are helping absolutely no one, and we hold them up as something that is superior to what we haven't tried. And that's what I think is so interesting, right? So we haven't tried a universal basic income or even a guaranteed income that would be targeted. I mean, if you take away the word universal, right, and it's guaranteed, then basically what you're saying is you're going to target it to a particular group in need. And I don't have any, although I, of course, I want us to get to universal basic income, I'm also not a person that is I'm not gonna admit that it would be it's great to have something that's like non-means tested that goes to certain groups that are super disadvantaged and being taken serious advantage of right now. And that would be anyone who is homeless. Is people are making money off of homeless people left and right, and putting their lives and their health in danger. So, so housing vouchers are better. Well, okay. Housing vouchers are not better. And the reason they're not better is because you have to be means tested for a housing voucher. And so, again, if you put paperwork and these different eligibility requirements, sometimes quite complex paperwork, that requires expense to file and expense to follow up on and all of that. If you do that, then what's happening is you're basically, that housing voucher is no longer universal, right? I mean, it has to, and if you have to apply for it, then you're just right from go. You're saying that you're okay with not every eligible person getting it, because that is exactly what happens when you means test things. So, a universal basic income can allow people, depending, now obviously, I mean, we don't need to like spend time talking about how the rent is much more expensive in certain places than it is in another. You know, we all know this, we're all aware of that. If you have a universal basic income, you can use it to meet your housing expense. And if it's pegged at a level that is adequate to a certain standard of like physical and mental survival, then it's going to be enough to live somewhere in decency and adequacy. Now, then it will be up to that person if they decide, well, you know, I want, you know, to be able to cover my whole rent. You know, I want to be able to cover all my rent and all my food expenses with my universal basic income. And so I'm going to choose to live somewhere where the housing costs are lower, or, you know, I'm going to stay in New York and maybe I'll do some additional thing to supplement my income or whatever. Whatever the person wants. But that's the point, is that the person, we have to stop allowing the people who create policy and people who legislate policy to act as if individuals have no agency and no ability to think. If we give people cash, they will do what is in their best interest. And you know what? It may happen that there may be places where the voucher or where the amount of money that you're giving somebody is not enough, you know, to pay a whole rent, or, you know, maybe there are some gaps. And then we'll have to create policy to fill those gaps. But, you know, the idea that that landlords all over the place are going to conspire to hike their rent because people have more money, you know, it really doesn't make a lot of sense. It's the same as food. You know, people aren't going to just raise the prices in all the supermarkets to eat up your UBI, because if they did, no one would shop there.
Exactly. Yeah, there was also a comment on social media this weekend, and it was so funny because somebody said, imagine like telling poor people they won't know how to spend their money when like we have learned how to operate on such a tiny little margin that it's just like offensive. My mom had 6 children. She knew what to do with every single solitary penny. So to tell poor people, oh, you're not going to know, like, oh, they're just going to raise the rent and you're going to be a victim to that. No, right. Poor people will figure out a way, you know? So
yeah,
it's just so silly that, we're just going to be victims and we're going to put up with it. Absolutely not.
Right. I mean, it's like, you know, the whole thing, and that's some of what happens with the idea that, oh, you can't take away service orgs, like you can't take money from service orgs because, you know, those poor people that can't think, you know, those poor vulnerable, you know, you hear a lot of this language in social work, right? And I really try to get away from it because, you know, I mean, I'm vulnerable too. Like, you know, I broke my knee 3 months ago and I couldn't walk around and I needed somebody to help me do stuff. And you know what? I was vulnerable. Every single one of us is vulnerable sometimes. Vulnerability is not this permanent characteristic of being poor, and not being able to help yourself is a very universal characteristic that we all have sometimes. I really like, this just kind of came to mind. I really like, and I really support, to a great degree, the work of the Poor People's Campaign, because the Poor People's Campaign is driven by the people who are being affected by the policies. And, it's just like they just break the whole myth. Like, they never have social services or social workers or anybody representing them. They represent, themselves, and it's great. These are people, and there are people that, they have such an eloquence about talking about the issues because they live them. And, I support them all the time.
I just laughed because I thought of my mom saying, I might be poor, but I ain't stupid. Like, we can be disadvantaged, but that doesn't make us, enfeebled or unable to, stand up for ourselves, advocate for ourselves.
I feel like it's part of that illusion of the meritocracy.
Completely.
We also completely treat that it is these rich people who are suddenly geniuses and can operate in all aspects of life. I think we really do treat income as a poor metric for capability.
Absolutely.
But yeah, Diane, I want to thank you so much for being here today, but I wanted to give you the floor. If there are any final thoughts you had or things you want people to go check out, can you let the folks out there know what they should be going to look into?
Yeah. So, there's so much more that we could talk about, right? But if I had to say a couple of closing things, I would like to invite people to think about how your federal government, how your state, how your locality is spending its money, whether it's spending it effectively, and in the context of, and to do that so that you can see that there's something very, very important that's part of the income movement that I would like to see people start doing, which is to fight back against the idea that, this idea that if you give $1,000 a month to a person, to a person to solve their own problems, or even $2,000 a month, or whatever quantity we decide upon, this pervasive idea that, we don't know if they'll spend it right, and we don't know if they'll solve their problem with it, and this and that, and they might waste it, and collectively that would be a big waste of money, right? Okay, so fight back against that by looking at what your state is spending and your federal government is spending, and recognize that it's you're much more buffered against waste of funds and corruption by giving an adequate amount of money to every individual person than what we have now, which is giving insanely large amounts of money to entities who then say they're going to solve the problem, and all the data shows that they don't. Whereas all of the data coming out of pilots, out of Stockton, out of Mississippi, out of Ontario before that was canceled on the 4,000 people who were benefiting from it. All of the data from those things show that it's a much better investment of public money to give small amounts of money to individuals than it is to give colossal amounts of money to large entities, because the corruption incentive and the incentive to impose to the incentive to kind of rework the mission to support you hanging on to gazillions of dollars is very, very strong. So please do that. I invite everyone to go start looking more carefully at what their localities and states are spending on poor people, whether or not it's solving problems, that sort of thing. And then the other thing that I would say is, the other thing that I wanted to say is that in terms of like where we are, really what is needed now is if every single person who believes in a universal basic income makes a commitment to get involved actively in 2021, that can mean an hour a month. It could mean 10 hours a month. It could mean donating I would say really great group to get involved in. My completely subjective opinion is get involved in Income Movement, bailoutthepeople.com. So much great work is going on. There's gonna be a whole bunch of events, online events. There was just an epic in-person live delivery of past due.
Well, it looks like she got frozen at the very end as she's given her closing remarks there. Oh, that's such a shame. It was such a pleasure to be able to get to talk to Diane. Hopefully she'll unfreeze. But if she doesn't, because this was still a plentiful conversation, we wanted to thank Diane for coming on to today's program. We want to echo her sentiments on the fact that the Income Movement is a very great organization. Without them, we would not have been able to talk with her today. So we were really appreciative of their help, and we do recommend that you all go check it out. And that furthermore, it looks like she's unfrozen, so we're gonna bring her back in here. Sorry, Diane, we took you out there for a bit because you froze up, but we were just echoing your sentiments about how great the Income Movement is. And how we wanted to tell people that, yeah, it's time for us to push back on this notion that poor people don't know what they're doing with their money. And that furthermore, we got to empower people and not these big bureaucracies. So that being said, Diane, I want to thank you again for coming on. Jackie, thank you for co-hosting with me today. And for everyone out there, again, we want to remind you to go make sure you like and subscribe if you liked what you heard today on our episode. You can go find Diane online. As she told you, there are a bunch of different groups that you can go help out with, from Bail Out the People to the Income Movement. And furthermore, that is going to conclude another episode, my friends. So we will talk to you all soon, my friends. Bye, and have a great rest of your week.
A rose by any other name still advocates just as sweet. Rosebuds, the Hill of Roses is no more. We are now the People's Basics. In the coming months, we'll be rolling out a new website, our comic series, and rewards to help support our new startup, media, and technology venture. In the meantime, check out our new podcast, The People's Basics, with hosts Jackie Sawicki and I, Jonathan Munitz, where we'll be breaking down a different societal basic each week with our friends, colleagues, and experts. Join us, and let's get back to the universal basics. Please help us by appeasing the algorithm gods with a like, share, subscribe, and hitting that bell today. Stay basic, my friends.